a little bit of funny backstory about this video. I spent a good week working on the script. Then, just as I was about to record the audio, George R.R. Martin drops his House of the Dragon blog post, which basically highlighted a lot of the points I made in the original script, specifically about blood and cheese and the issues with cutting Maelor from the show. So, I've had to go back and rework the context of this video, which is why it's taken so long, as I felt the original script was effectively mirroring most of George's points. Now, how I feel about House of the Dragon's take on blood and cheese is complicated, and it's taken me a while to really process how I feel about it. And it wasn't until George R.R. Martin's blog post I firmly really landed on a position. Regardless, by now we can say that huge elements of House of the Dragon Season 2 have been very divisive among viewers, something I could really not have predicted in the build-up to the season, given the goodwill Season 1 had managed to create. So I was kind of caught off guard by the reaction to blood and cheese at the time, which is clear if you watch my reviews. What I couldn't figure out is, did I feel like this because I was surprised people didn't like it, or was I feeling like this because I agree with the criticisms of blood and cheese? Having some time now to kind of think about it, it's a little of column A and a little of column B. And just like a lot of the issues with the writing of House of the Dragon, there is no defined, clear answer. But before we really get into this analysis, what I will say is this. Blood and cheese is one of the biggest plot twists in Fire and Blood, and is truly horrific and shocking. Rightly or wrongly, it was being called the Red Wedding moment of House of the Dragon. Given the impact that moment has in the books, and the impact it had on fans, it's extremely surprising we are even in a situation where the success and impact of Blood and Cheese is up for debate. The fact that George R.R. Martin himself has opened up with his criticisms of the show really says a lot, coming from a man who's always been quite diplomatic. In this analysis, we'll be taking a look at what made Blood and Cheese so impactful in the book, and how the show's version was so different, why changes were made, and the impact they had. And finally, the bigger issues with Blood and Cheese that have really been overlooked by quite a lot of fans. Blood and Cheese as a moment in Fire and Blood is perhaps one of the standout elements of it, with some calling it the Red Wedding of the Dance of the Dragons, long before House of the Dragon even existed. It's not hard to see why it left an impact on so many book readers. It's horrific, shocking, and changes the game in a huge way. Just like the Red Wedding. It's the first huge blow for the Greens, and alongside the death of Lucerys at the hands of Aemon, all but ensures there is no longer any hope of peace between the Blacks and the Greens. When I describe my journey of reading Fire and Blood for the first time, I often describe it as this. I started off very much enjoying the concept of Rhaenyra as a character, and started off leaning towards the Black faction. Then Blood and Cheese just flips the script, and for me, I was suddenly seeing the Blacks as the villainous faction, and my support started to lean towards the Greens. Then as the war gets bitter and bloodier, you realise in reality both sides are awful, committing numerous traitorous acts and war crimes against each other and the small folk. Hence the bitter taste you have at the war's end as you enter the Regency and realise what was all this really for? What was the point? Which I kind of think very much fits George R.R. Martin's worldview and opinions of war, and very much the message he wanted to get across with the Dance of the Dragons. So for me, that is why both the death of Lucerys and Blood and Cheese are such vital elements in moving the reader along this journey, and why it was so vital for the show to get them right. And therein lies the first issue that only becomes even clearer now the season has finished. What the central conflict of the story is in the show versus the book is very different. Even in Season 1, it's clear the show was much more about the conflict between Alicent and Rhaenyra than Aegon and Rhaenyra, and thus the repercussions and impact of events like Blood and Cheese were always going to have a different context than in the book, because of how it's being framed. The first point of contention for many fans was how the show handled the son for a son concept of Blood and Cheese, and thus Daemon's role in it. It was the first part of this to really cause a lot of fans to question the show's direction. About a week before the episode aired, there were a lot of people who got early access to it, and were claiming that Daemon didn't order the death of Jaehaerys, and that it was simply an accident. So yeah, given that leak, people were already up in arms. And while that statement only turned out to be half true, without the context of episode 2, it very much did seem like they were downplaying the responsibility of Daemon in the murder, taking away his culpability. The truth is, I think the way the show handled the son for a son part of Daemon's role actually makes a lot more sense in the context of the TV show. So in the show, the target of Blood and Cheese is in fact Aemon Targaryen and not Jaehaerys or Maelor. As much as I love Blood and Cheese, an issue I always did have with the books is the fact it did seemingly target Jaehaerys rather than say Aegon or Aemond, the man who did actually kill Lucerys, both much higher value targets. So this change in the show, to me at least, did actually work and fix some of these more minor issues for me. While the approach is different, Daemon is still 100% responsible for child murder. A lot of people seem to miss the point that Daemon is still culpable. It was made clear in the show he greenlit Jaehaerys as the backup plan, and it really did baffle me that so many people missed this element. It all led up to that wonderfully acted confrontation between Daemon and Rhaenyra in episode 2. So Daemon still is the mastermind and still is responsible. However, in the context of the show, I do feel, for the most part, these changes do make sense. However, I wish I could say the same and be as positive about the rest of the sequence. George R.R. Martin rightly points out in his blog post, the lack of Maelor in House of the Dragon is the very thing that fundamentally changes what Blood and Cheese is, and really limits its impact. Now, I'm not going to go into the drama around the blog post, I've already made a video about that. But the butterfly effect of cutting Maelor cannot be understated in terms of the impact it has, firstly on Blood and Cheese, but also on events into season 3 and 4. Blood and Cheese as an act itself is already horrific. The brutal murder of a child as his mother watches on. But if you focus away from the horror, the part of Blood and Cheese that really sticks with me is the psychological aspect of it in regards to Helaena. The idea that she's made to choose between her two sons. Maelor then being mocked, told his mother wanted him dead, the double cross, killing Jaehaerys. For me, it's some of George R.R. Martin's best work, and I can only imagine what it would have been like if he'd written it in the style of the main books, and not the detached nature of Fire and Blood. I think in that context it could even surpass the Red Wedding. When you lose Maelor, you lose the Sophie's Choice aspect of the murder. You lose the psychological horror, you lose the sheer impact it has on Helaena as a character. It utterly breaks her, and that's not even speaking to the butterfly effect no Maelor has on the rest of the show. The truth of the matter is, even with or without Maelor, the show's take on Blood and Cheese was always going to be fundamentally different from the book for a few key reasons. That really goes back to the changes made during season 1. Helaena is simply not the same character. She's clearly neurodivergent in the show and has these prophetic visions. The way Helaena reacts in this situation is always going to be different because of that. The more detached reaction we get in the show makes sense within the context of the characters it's created. But I don't really think the change has really been one of the better, and is another example of how minor changes to characters drastically can change them down the road. The other aspect here, there was never going to be lots of blood and gore like in the book. They were always going to have to be a bit creative with how they showed the act itself. Frankly, I think the way they did show the actual murder was good enough. The sounds were gut-wrenching, and focusing on Helena's reaction did kind of work. Would I have preferred the book version? Yes, of course, but they could never have played it like that. If we're being honest, I think there were clear signs that Blood and Cheese might not hit the mark during season 1, when we consider we only have 1 or 2 scenes involving Helaena and her children. Without spending that time with Helaena and Aegon as a family during season 1, it makes Blood and Cheese feel quite jarring, solely relying on the audience empathy rather than the pre-established relationships. For the most part, the actual Blood and Cheese sequence itself was good. It's shot well, it's well acted by all the cast, and I can't really say anything negative about the actual execution of the sequence. It still drawed me in with the anticipation and dread, the same way watching The Red Wedding did when I was watching it for the first time. My girlfriend, who's never read the books, was utterly horrified by it. But I will caveat this, before the sequence had finished, as my anticipation was dying down, I began to question some of the creative choices made in a way I never did with The Red Wedding. And yes, a lot of it comes back to the lack of Maelor, and the fact when looking at Blood and Cheese as a whole, I felt more outraged and bad about the treatment of Cheese's dog than the actual murder of a child. At the same time, I did chalk this up to the lack of time spent with Helaena and her children, but the more I thought about it, the more issues with Blood and Cheese in terms of the writing I started to find. So yes, while the sequence was successful and well done, because of the changes made, half the fanbase seemed to actually care more about Cheese's dog than the event itself. So as well shot and acted as Blood and Cheese was, it cannot fix the poor foundations it was set up with. It worked well in the context of the show, but the issue is the context the show has created is so much less impactful than what this moment was supposed to be. No, I don't love the show's Blood and Cheese, but it's fine. It is flawed but does the job. There are a lot of other legitimate criticisms with how they handled this, other than just Maelor and Helaena, that George R.R. Martin did in fact not touch upon in his blog post, that I do want to take a moment to look at. I think not having Alicent involved in the scene at all was a huge misstep, and while I couldn't figure out why they chose this path, her being caught having sex with Kristen Cole and the resulting shame of it does add some interesting character moments. But then as the season progressed, it did kind of hit me why the writers may have chosen this. Alicent in the show is a very different character to Alicent in the book, and it's clear from Alicent's season 2 arc they wanted her to try and be this peacemaker, never quite losing hope at some resolution being found. This is an Alicent who should have been her enemy in the Sept in episode 2, days after the murder of her grandson, and let her walk away, free, when she could have ended the war in a moment. The Alicent who flees to Dragonstone in the finale, selling out her children and family. I have a whole video coming breaking down Alicent's arc. I already found her logic and motivation, this need for her connection to Rhaenyra, puzzling during season 2. I felt it should have been left behind during season 1. Jaehaerys' murder really is the point of no return for Alicent in the book, in salvaging peace, and I think is what it should have also been in the show. But I believe the writers trying to force Alicent down this ill-fitting arc is an attempt to have it make a bit more sense, thus removing her from witnessing the murder itself and being an active part of Blood and Cheese. I think if you have Alicent actually witness the murder, it makes her flawed logic and decision-making less justifiable than it already is. Before we move on, let's just go back to the sex scene issue in the first place. This was another thing that was leaked before the episode, but as I was watching it, I was still shocked that this is truly the path they went down. Yes, it created a shocking moment and a plot twist, but at the cost of the full impact of Blood and Cheese. It really kind of dampened it slightly. So, much like Maelor, all these minor changes they make to other characters like Alicent all do have a butterfly effect. However, in this case, I do think it's more to do with the writers trying to justify their end goal of Alicent's character this season. All of this really connects back into what I think is the biggest issue with Blood and Cheese, and it's nothing to do with the sequence itself. It can only really be seen once you look back at the season as a whole. It's meant to be one of the two key tipping points of the dance alongside the death of Lucerys that basically makes any chance at peace hopeless. The weight of this moment and the impact it has on the rest of the Dance of the Dragons should not be and cannot be understated. But in House of the Dragon, the death of Jaehaerys, while it's the focus of the first 3 episodes, is very quickly forgotten, and all in all felt kind of meaningless. It really lacked this game-changing impact it should have had. Battle lines should have been drawn. There was no going back. It's war, with only one side coming out the victor. But no. A line in the season finale that really irritated me greatly was Rhaenyra's speech to Alicent about for any chance at peace, sacrifice had to be made, as if both sides by this point had not already sacrificed a hell of a lot. But the audacity for the writers to actually have Rhaenyra say a son for a son, implying that Aegon needed to be killed or allowed to be killed, had me rolling my eyes. Just highlights how little Blood and Cheese meant that even for Alicent at this point, Jaehaerys is forgotten and doesn't matter, is a non-factor, brushed under the carpet so the writers can still flimsily justify Alicent's arc and her relationship with Rhaenyra. At the end of the day, Blood and Cheese had no legacy on the story and no long-term impact. It's not a point of no return. You could have cut Blood and Cheese in its entirety, and with minimal adjustment the story still could have worked, when that should have been far from the case. It didn't have the impact it was supposed to, because the impact gets in the way of the story the writers want to tell, rather than the story they should have been telling. There's also another aspect at play that I think might have played a part as to why some fans, both show and book, felt a bit disappointed by Blood and Cheese. Did we as a fanbase hype it up too much? When I think back to the Red Wedding, if you never read the book before, it's more likely that you would never have heard that phrase before. Thus, the Red Wedding in the show truly did come out of nowhere for a lot of fans. I don't think that's been the case with Blood and Cheese. Being part of this fan base, when I think back, from the moment House of the Dragon was greenlit, fans in comment sections would always talk about how awesome Blood and Cheese is going to be to see on screen. The term Blood and Cheese had become commonplace during discussions around Season 1, and prevalent in the build-up of Season 2 due to the discourse regarding how it changes the story. Hell, even writers and producers named it in interviews during Season 1. The result of this is even fans who had not read the books were aware that this big shocking plot twisting event was going to happen at the start of Season 2. We as fans hyped up Blood and Cheese so much during the long wait for Season 2 that I think it frankly became impossible for the show to ever reach expectations, even if it were a one-for-one perfect adaptation of the book. Imagine if there had been 2 years of hype and discourse for the Red Wedding. I do believe it would have somewhat dampened the impact that it had. Now please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying for a second that this gives a free pass to the writers at all. They still made some questionable choices with the writing and direction they wanted to go in. It would be disingenuous of me, for the sake of presenting a balanced perspective, not to recognise there may have also been some external factors out of the control of the writers as well. But in all, this aspect pales in comparison to the other points that we've discussed in this video. So what is my takeaway from this discussion? The show's take on Blood and Cheese as a piece of television was fine. It did the job, was still horrific, and was physically executed well. The writers made some questionable changes that 100% will have a huge impact going forward, but as an isolated piece of TV, it's fine. But that is kind of the issue for a lot of fans. Blood and Cheese should have been way more than fine. It should have been game-changing and monumental. But in the end, it was just another plot twist, and all of this can be traced back to the fact that in the long run, over the course of the season, it really had very little impact on the narrative and the direction of the characters. It was forgotten and didn't have the lasting legacy it does in the books. It lacked true weight and consequences. And for me, that's the much bigger issue than a badly implemented Alicent sex scene or lack of blood and gore.